People have talked about how the streaming bubble is about to burst, and it's news like this that makes me think that it's going to happen sooner rather than later, because Netflix reportedly spent $166 million for both parts of Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, and I can't imagine they're going to be able to recoup the cost on this through new subscribers and advertisers. Maybe the mindset is that if they produce enough original content, whether it's shows or movies, that they're going to have more subscribers come to their site over other ones, and maybe the whole of the site is greater than the sum of the parts. And this isn't necessarily unique to Netflix per se. All the other streaming services seem to be doing the same thing, hence why the streaming bubble is about to burst, because I don't think it really is going to work out the way they're hoping it's going to work out. Because just take Rebel Moon and Netflix, for instance, because Netflix have basically been producing several of Zack Snyder movies lately, and they really haven't been bringing out new subscribers to the site. In fact, we've seen a diminishing return when it came to Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2. And I think as a result of all this, Netflix is going to be thinking twice about whether they're going to work with Zack Snyder again. The second chapter in Zack Snyder's dark and slow motion heavy intergalactic saga, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, has debuted on Netflix to significantly lower viewing figures than its predecessor. The sequel to Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, the film claimed the top spot on Netflix's weekly streaming chart upon its release. However, fans feel uncertain about the franchise's future after the latest viewing figures showed that Part 2 underperformed in comparison to Part 1. The next paragraph goes into a little bit more details about it. In the first 3 days of its premiere on Netflix, Rebel Moon Part 2 clocked in 44 million hours of viewership, which that's nothing to scoff at, assuming those figures are accurate, because it did take the number one spot on Netflix temporarily. But when you compare it to Rebel Moon Part 2, which got 54 million hours within the same time frame of its premiere, then that shows that not only were people less excited about seeing Part 2, but in the preceding months since Part 1 came out, it really weren't able to bring more people into the fold. Now, you would think that at first you would have the hardcore fans of like Zack Snyder coming out to watch Rebel Moon Part 1, and then through good word of mouth, it'd start bringing more people in. So Part 2, if Rebel Moon Part 1 was really good, then there would be more people watching Part 2 when it came out. But that just wasn't the case here, because word of mouth just really wasn't in favor for this movie. And we can see that reflected in the audience and critic scores on sites like Rotten Tomatoes, because it says here, the audience score, although better, still isn't anything to boast about at 52%. Snyder's diehard fan base have come out in force to defend the film, with Part 2 receiving several 5-star user reviews, hailing the movie as one of the best movies with excellent storytelling. And that's according to someone who doesn't know what good storytelling actually is. However, there is little middle ground in user reviews, with most others declaring Part 2 as a 1 or 2-star film, labeling it as a disaster or simply not enough. And this is obviously bad news for Zack Snyder and some of his more ardent supporters, because he previously said that he envisioned this to be a 6-part franchise. Netflix wanted to have their own Star Wars with interconnected movies and shows and producing graphic novels and other things like that to try to drive audiences to their own site. But it seems like because of the results of Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2, that it's even doubtful whether they're going to get a Part 3, even though the ending of Rebel Moon Part 2 kind of tried to set up for that. But if there is going to be a Part 3, star of Rebel Moon movie, Sofia Boutella, has said that there hasn't been any talk about it and she's not really expecting as much. When asked if she's talked to director Zack Snyder about joining forces for Rebel Moon Part 3, Boutella admitted she had not yet, shutting down fan hopes that initial plans for a threequel were in the works with the franchise's leading star. No, not yet. But it would be amazing if they can go and find Princess Issa, because that's what we say at the end of movie number 2. And it'll be quite fun to go back on set with Zack, because we all love being part of this project so much. So to be fair, it's not like she's saying it's not going to happen entirely. It's just, you would think at this point that there would be word if there was going to be a Part 3, but since it's up in the air, it's not a good sign for it, especially since it was only able to maintain the number 1 spot on Netflix for basically just a few days before it was knocked off of the number 1 spot and replaced with the Sydney Sweeney movie, Anyone But You, which is not necessarily surprising because that's a new movie to Netflix, and that also was pretty popular and had a good theatrical run. So I can see why that was able to dethrone it after just a few days of it being on the number 1 spot. The second Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon movie debuted this past weekend and quickly rose to the top of Netflix's movie charts. Unfortunately, like its predecessor, it couldn't hang on to the #1 spot for very long. Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, was dethroned as Netflix's top movie less than a week after it premiered, thanks to Sweeney and Glen Powell. And you can see the charts right here as of today. Anyone But You is the #1 spot. Rebel Moon had actually dropped a couple below that, so it's currently sitting at #3 in the US. But to give a little bit more credit to Rebel Moon Part 2, it is actually the #1 spot globally, but that's because some of these other movies aren't necessarily playing in other countries. So make with that what you will. Still, I'm going to give some credit to Rebel Moon Part 2 because it is currently the top most viewed movie on Netflix in the world. So there's something to be celebrated there for Zack Snyder fans, but still, that doesn't look like it's going to be enough to continue on with this franchise. And it seems like Netflix spent a lot of money on something that they were hoping was going to be the next Star Wars for Netflix. And by all indicators, that's really not going to be the case. But let me know what you think about all this in the comment section below. Did you actually like Rebel Moon movies? Do you think they should continue with it? Or do you think this was just kind of a failed experiment on the part of Netflix and on Zack Snyder? And if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with the latest in entertainment news. And if you can, click that like button and share the video with your friends because it helps out with the channel. Thank you.